Hello, everyone. We're going to get started with our talk. I'm Andra Russick from Scheinbaum and Russick Gallery in Santa Fe. I'm a member of AIPAD. I'm also the chair of the Education Committee for AIPAD. I just want to welcome you all here. We're so excited to have you here. We're so excited to be at the Park Avenue Armory. Tonight's Night of Photography talk is going to be wonderful. We're moderated by Jean Dykstra, who is the editor of Photograph Magazine and also the editor and writer of our exposure, AIPAD Exposures, which comes out on our emails all the time. Cathy Kaplan, David Mahoney, and Todd Levin. I'm going to let Jean do the introductions to them, but I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight. We're thrilled to have you here, and we're thrilled to be here with all of you. Please enjoy the talk and enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Andra. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today on this gorgeous day. I hope everybody's enjoying the fair. If any of you here are interested in starting a photography collection or expanding a photography collection, or just interested in what goes into collecting photography, you definitely came to the right talk. Cathy Kaplan, David Mahoney, and Todd Levin have advised institutional collections, personal collections. They have their own fantastic collections. They have a deep knowledge of the medium, and they each have a terrific eye. So I'm sure you're going to get a lot of information and insight this afternoon, and we'll be sure to leave time at the end for questions also. I'm just going to do some quick introductions before we get started. Cathy Kaplan is a retired partner of the law firm SIDLEY Austin, LLP. While at SIDLEY, Cathy focused her practice on a wide range of structured finance projects and art-related matters, and she continues to help curate the art collection in SIDLEY's New York office. Cathy currently consults and represents collectors, artists, and art institutions, and she's a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, where she teaches a course on the law and finance of the art market. Cathy's chair of the board at Aperture and co-chair of the photography committee at the Whitney Museum. She's also on the governing board of the Yale University Art Gallery and on the board of the Bronx Council on the Arts. David Mahoney bought his first photograph in 1975 as a broke and seemingly unemployable college graduate. Since then, the two things necessary to a collector, time and money, have varied wildly as he built up an expansive collection of American photographs from 1850 to the present. He's a trustee and former head of the Photography Accessions Group at SFMOMA. Particular strengths of his collection include 19th century pieces, works from the 1970s, representation of female photographers, and art from his adopted home state of California. While the collection spans timeframes, processes, styles, and genres, the collective intent is to illuminate aspects of the American experience. Works from the collection have appeared in museum shows across the United States and Europe. Todd Levin is director of Levin Art Group, an art advisory firm. The Levin Art Group has been thoroughly immersed in the art market for 40 years and advises both private, high net worth individuals and public museums and institutions. And the firm has been responsible for the purchase of over $1 billion worth of art. In 2023, Levin was selected by The Observer as one of the most influential people in the art world today, and by Art News as one of the top 9 advisors and advisory firms in the world for their annual Top 75 Art Professionals list. Levin is an executive member and past board member of the Association of Professional Art Advisors. So I thought we would maybe start with Cathy. We have some pictures of your collection, and maybe you can just...
Mostly pictures of my dog, actually.
Maybe you can just talk a bit about your collection.
Told you. Yeah, there's my personal collection, which is mostly, as everybody, you start collecting one place and you find you drift other places. So if I had to define it in 2 lines, it's mostly photography by and about women often focused on fashion and portraiture, how women are portrayed and portray themselves. You know, one of the artists I have the most work by is Diane Arbus. And, you know, the gaze, the look, how Arbus viewed women and other people was really important to me. But then there are pictures, as you can see, of dogs. And, you know, once you get, you know, what I say to people is a personal collection is just that. It is a personal collection. And the way I would collect for myself versus the way I built a collection for SIDLEY are entirely different. As in this picture, there are pictures of my dogs by Elliot Erwitt, William Wegman, Charlotte Dumas. They have been photographed by everybody, Martin Parr, but that's not in this one. And it engages me and amuses me, and therefore it is part of my collection. And I think a personal collection, unless the only reason you're collecting is to donate it to the Metropolitan Museum, should engage and delight you. It should be things that you both are excited when you see it and say, I want to live with that, I want to own it. And it's things that you get continuous pleasure out of. And I think that's, as you can probably see, that's a lot of what I do. I think, David, your pictures were showing up next.
Sorry about that, yeah.
So as the introduction said, I collect American photography. I didn't start out necessarily that way, but after a number of years of collecting, sat down and said, what have I done? And what does it tell me about where to go? And it was amazingly freeing to conclude that I could focus on American. That really narrowed it. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but it really does work, because you can walk into a booth of Atche and say, these are beautiful, I don't need to really look at them, and move on. But it is a very broad-ranging collection, works of art on paper, so 1850s to the present, 19th century, in this example, Western landscapes, and things that, as the introduction said, talk something about the American experience. And what that means is it doesn't need to be an American photographer, nor does it mean that an American photographer qualifies. So on the one hand, Lisa Sephardi's amazing pictures of American teenagers, even though she is a French artist, very much fits the collection. Todd Webb's wonderful pictures from Paris do not. And so it's finding that theme and finding something that has some weight, some history, either as an object, love this picture, by Tony Hernandez of women sunbathing on a construction site in Southern California. I also like a little humor in the pictures.
I wanted to ask, Cathy, since we saw those pictures of you in your home with the dogs and with the, how do you live with your collection? Do you rotate pictures?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, again, I rotate all the time, I add all the time. And one of the points I was going to make is, even though I say I collect photography by and about women and mostly fashion and portrait, chairing the board of Aperture, being on the Whitney Photo Committee, I see a lot of young photographers who don't fit any of those definitions. But I get engaged and excited and want to support their work. So I will buy things that you'll say, huh, really? But they again, please me. They're often, the one thing I'm pretty consistent is they're almost always figures and humans in my work, or dogs. And I like that. I tell people, I just walk around sort of communicating with my collection, and I say that only half in jest, because part of why I like to collect pictures with people is I really feel like I can relate to them. You know, I may relate to the photographer, but I also relate to the object. But no, I change around all the time.
Yeah.
And that amuses me, and I rotate. I have a house upstate, and things go in and out of the house and back to the city. And when I was at SIDLEY, there were about 40 pieces of mine floating on different floors of SIDLEY. So
That's great. Do you do the same? Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I think the old truism is you become a collector when you buy the picture that you know cannot go on. There's no wall space for it, right? So that's the moment you cross the barrier. And, you know, their works of art on paper, you know, they can only hang for so long. You want to be careful about them, particularly things that are, depending on the process, whatever. But you don't want to have something like that Hervé Friend 1892 albumin picture sitting around on a wall for years on end.
Right.
So there's plenty to rotate from, and I rotate frequently.
Well, some of those conservation questions I want to get into in a minute, but Todd, I wanted to ask you, if someone comes to you interested in starting or expanding their collection, what are some of the initial conversations you might have with someone?
I think aside from the obvious components of what is it that you do and how do you do it and how much do you charge and, you know, the nuts and bolts stuff, the biggest initial discussions have more to do with the educational modality rather than the transactional modality. The transactional modality, basically, I think a trained monkey could do that pretty easily. But the educational modality is where the really great collectors are built. And the discussions tend to, I think, revolve more or less in one way or another around the idea of taste. How is taste created? How is it formed? Who's responsible for disseminating taste throughout culture? Does this include an aspect of gatekeeping, and is that important or necessary or not? And then how one forms their own sense of taste with the understanding that it's mutable, right? What your sense of taste was perhaps at one point in your collecting art, some of that may apply at a later point, and some of it may not apply remotely. And so taste is something that's mutable. And so knowing that, how does one create a collection based on one's personal taste when you're dealing with something that's so fluid? So those are a lot of the discussions, I think, at the initial point, particularly with younger collectors who have been involved for a certain amount of time. While they do have their own sense of taste, they're at least a little more their experience in collecting that's already occurred over time has given them a certain amount of expertise to already make some of those assessments. I'm there to prod them harder in many cases, but with a younger collector, those discussions haven't even taken place. So it depends where you are in the collecting arc, I think, in terms of when any advisor, me or somebody else, kind of enters that picture. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I got into doing what I do, and I got interested in art because it helped me better understand myself. And I think that's perhaps the most profound use value of art in broad strokes. But what that means to each individual collector, what that means to each individual person, obviously is going to be extraordinarily different.
Right. You both talked about developing or building your collections around certain themes, either smaller themes like by women or American photography. Is that something you'd encourage a collector to do just because it helps narrow the field? There's just so much to look at that it helps narrow things down?
Most collectors do that a little bit just because of that, because otherwise, I was taking some friends around around AIPAD before, and they were looking and saying, how do I enter this? They're fairly new collectors. And I said, well, let's walk the aisles and see what speaks to you. But I had seen what they already owned, and I said, there are certain things I can tell already. You focus on certain things, on people, on this. Start looking at that. It doesn't mean you can't buy something else when it speaks to you.
Right.
And again, I think one of the things I would go back to on photography particularly, but it's true of prints and anything else, you don't have to put your kids' college education at risk buying works of art. The fabulous thing about a medium that is multiples is that it's accessible, and it's accessible at different price points. And when you're starting out, what I tell people, I had members of my Columbia Law School class here last night, and they walked through and they said, you know, there's stuff we could buy. And I said, absolutely. There totally is. And I said, you know, if you're spending the same thing you would on a jacket or a sweater, don't worry. If it speaks to you, buy it. And if next year it's out of fashion, it's out of fashion. Contribute it, move it, put it in the bathroom. When you begin to get more deeply into it and are, quote, collecting and spending more money, it's a different, then you really have to understand what you're buying, understanding the quality of the print, understand the provenance if you can find it. It's just a different equation, but you don't have to rarefy it that way. You can buy things you enjoy.
And I think fairs like this are actually a wonderful place. I was just, in thinking about this conversation, I was trying to remember the first AIPAD I went to, and I had the year wrong, but it was actually 1986. It was at the Claremont Resort in Oakland, California. And at that fair, I knew nothing, basically, about photography at that point. I mean, I had met Sandy and was starting to learn a little bit, but I did not know a lot. And I met two of the dealers who taught me a lot at that fair, who were absolutely willing to answer the dumbest possible question. And believe me, I had dumber questions than anyone in this room. And you know, one of the reasons that dealers do fairs like this, maybe the reason, is to find new clients. Yeah. And so they are incredibly open to conversations and questions, including the question like, why does X cost Y? When I thought I saw a picture 7 booths away that cost half Y. And they won't be insulted by that question, and you'll learn something in the process.
And when you develop a relationship with dealers, they will tell you, you know, I remember when I was starting out, I'd say, send me every image you have of Diane Arbus. I just want to look at, and send me the old ones, the new ones, even by email, you know? And if I looked at every image by a photographer, I began to sort of sort through what interested me, and then I'd go see them in person and feel, dealers are amazingly willing to do that. And you walk around the fair, and there are artists too, standing around and want to talk about their work, and don't think every single person who walks up to them is going to buy something. No. That's actually not the point at all. It's really to develop people who are interested. I mean, they're interested in their work, you are too.
You touched on this, and I don't want to get too into the weeds with some of this stuff, but I wonder if it's helpful. I don't know where everybody in the audience is as far as collecting or just an interest, but to talk a little bit about the idea of multiples and editions and why, as you said, you know, one print of an image might be much more expensive than another print of the same image. Can you sort of just talk about that a little bit?
Do you want to start, or?
Yeah.
I'm happy to.
There's a lot to unpack behind that question. We don't even have time here, really, to do that. But in any medium that deals with multiples, this could be photography, this could be fine art prints, for that matter, and this applies to contemporaneous work that we're seeing here largely at the fair, as well as to very, very historic prints going back to, gee whiz, the 15th century by Cranach or others. There has developed over time a kind of expertise in these fields of multiples and in the judgment of these multiples as to if you have 3 or 10 or 2 or 100 of a sort of the same thing, how can I confer both value and price, which are two different things. The value is the aesthetic value, the historical value, that's the qualitative components of a work of art, as well as the price, which is the transactional or the quantitative component of an artwork. And depending on the medium, photography in this case, there is a extremely broad scope of educational components that have been built up to help you as a potential collector. If you're looking at a specific work of art, if this is done in a multiple and it's an edition of 50, why this one would cost X and why that one might cost the same, this one is number 29 of 50, this one here in this hand is number 28 of 50. But why this one might cost twice as much as this one, or it might cost half as much as this one. So going into all of that right now, might take a long period of time. But the point is that this information is easily gettable. It is easily gettable. There are so many books written about this, these approaches. This is free, obviously. It's Googleable at sources that are, well written. So the information is very, very easy to find, certainly. And you also have the benefit of talking to people, not necessarily even like me, but other collectors who are thrilled to stop in the aisle and spend 45 minutes with you, giving a detailed layout as to why number 28 of 50 is worth X and why 29 of 50 is worth Y.
Yeah, and I think there's a perception in photography broadly, as people are starting to get into it, that there must be thousands of whatever.
Right.
And, so the classic, or a classic example is you'll see Edward Weston period prints here that might say 6 of 50, and you go, oh, there's 50 of them out there. Well, actually, Edward never got to 50. That 6 might have been the very last one. Maybe a little more so in contemporary, that if someone says it's 1 of 25, there is the potential for there to be 25. But going back in not that far in history, I have a particular interest in 1970s pictures, and Tony Hernandez is a good example. There was no market. And so while there theoretically could be many, many, many copies of these things, it costs money. You needed darkroom time. You needed to pay for your paper. And so if you had no market, why would you make a lot of prints? There's an example of a photographer, Donna Lee Phillips, whose work I chased for a period of time. Erin did a show that included some of this work. And I had seen this work, this series, reproduced multiple different places. And I figured there must be multiple sets. There was one vintage set. Same photographs were being shown all over the world, but she never printed it again. And so it's important to sort of dig in and to ask the questions, get the information, and to learn.
And I think that goes to the, relationships with dealers, collectors, museum, sitting on museum acquisition committee, because the truth is, it's a mess. If you're trying to say, well, there's only one of this or one of that. No. It's and there's been litigation about that sort of thing. Gee, I thought I had the only one because it was this size, and look, you made it this size, and suddenly there are another 15 of them. But I think there are a couple of things. Information is accessible online, much more than ever was. But when you want to dig into something, and it's back to my point about how much you're spending. If you go and, like Aperture this week is doing a Danny Lyon little print for $200 or $250, as many as you want this week only. And it's one of the famous biker images. But that if 500 people want it this week, they're all going to get it in that size. And that's fine. And you're paying for that. If you want a vintage print made by Danny at a certain point, you're going to spend a lot more, and you go to the gallery and you talk about it. And education, a friend of mine asked for advice on buying a Cortez print. I've never bought any. I actually don't know much. I mean, I know the work, but I certainly don't know. And I was looking at some that were coming up for auctions, and I called a dealer I knew and said, look, tell me were any of them, you know, I educated myself because I didn't know a particular artist's practice. And I think that, again, that's part of it. People will talk to you and you can educate yourself. And it is absolutely inconsistent, depending on the artist, what you're dealing with.
And if I could add one other thing, I mean, just the advice I give is use your eyes. Prints can be, you know, condition is one of the things that will set value. You know, the 28 versus 29, if it had a crimp on the side, would change the value. And I'll plead guilty to being a condition queen, but you need to know when to let that go a little bit. So you mentioned Dandelion. I mean, just accident that there were two prints of a Dandelion print called Clarksdale that came up. One was absolutely pure, pristine vintage, and one was printed probably 5 years later. Now, normally you would think that the first one had to be more valuable. It's truly vintage. But when you looked at the two pictures side by side, one sang and one didn't. So the picture 5 years later is the one that you would want to own, and your eyes will tell you that.
Well, we won't even get into topics like 70s color photography. That has, over the years, if you go for a vintage 1970 photograph
Like Stephen Shore.
Well, I tell a story, and I told it this morning at the SIDLEY, that I went to the Metropolitan Museum for the SIDLEY collection, and we bought one. They still had the sets that they did in 1971 when he had the solo show. And I knew the issue. It wasn't like we didn't go in knowing the color wasn't perfect. But I said, okay, it was really cheap. We'd frame them. This was for a corporate collection, and see how they held up. Boy, they turned sepia within so quickly, with museum glass in a dark corridor. They just went. And so what would you rather have? If, you know, is that better than one he reprinted that looks exactly like Stephen expected it to look now? And that's the problem. There's not a universal answer to this at all. And also, your example about Warren, I like some of the fashion pictures that were used in Harper's or Vogue. So they're all, you know, I have some Norman Parkinsons that look crunched up and felt and have signs, or Harper's Bazaar, and they have Carmel Snow's print on the back. And I just love that as a vintage object.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's got a history and weight to it.
Yeah, and to me, that's part of what I'm buying there.
You were talking about condition and the 1970s color prints. How much do you think a collector should know, or maybe how much did you know when you were starting, about all of the different processes, about gelatin silver prints and C prints and ambrotypes and daguerreotypes? How much did you know about that, and how can someone who's collecting find out about that?
You're probably more processed than I am, so I'll let you answer, because I kind of go with I know enough, but I don't care. I buy images more.
To Todd's point about where information sits, there are multiple super good glossaries on the web around different processes that will give you either a 3-line summary or a 300-line summary, and you can decide how much you want to learn. But it is one of the process is one of the things that will set value. Is this, you know, even not a true photo? Is it a photogravure, or is it a silver print, or is it a platinum print? All of the same image, all done by the same artist. Those will have different values. And you know, the best way to learn, again, is use your eyes and use your mouth.
And a dealer told me that the way they learned about process is going on YouTube. And looking at videos on how a silver gelatin print is made versus a platinum print versus a chromogenic. There's a lot of information out there, pretty easily accessible.
Yeah, because most collectors didn't start off necessarily as photographers, so don't really know. Yeah. It can be intimidating, I think, to museums not so much, but galleries can be really intimidating. How do you advise people to approach galleries. The fair, I think, is different because everybody's walking around and talking, but to walk into a quiet gallery, it can be intimidating.
I think fairs are a good way to start because I do think, despite everything, galleries are intimidating and they often don't have prices up for better or whatever the New York law says. They don't. And I think that if I walked in as a young, particularly young collector, to an empty gallery, I'd be like a little, Whereas if you meet people at the fairs, it's a really good way to start the relationship and then build on it. And that's one of the beauties of fairs. And, even just walking around with somebody, if you're from a museum, or just walk around with a group and watch them interact with the dealers.
Yeah.
And don't go alone. Go with a friend, or somebody who may have a connection with that gallery. But
again, I think
if you stop, if you're in I'm not talking Gagosian, but if you're in a photography gallery and you stop in front of a picture and you spend more than a minute or two looking at it, someone's going to come talk with you. It's almost a guarantee.
They might even tell you the price if you ask.
You might, exactly right. You might even be able to get the price.
But actually, back to the point, I think the museum collecting committees and affinity groups are also really good ways where you can enter, at different levels. Again, not everything is a board of trustees of a museum. And they'll often organize trips and gallery. I know with Aperture we've organized just gallery walks for younger people to walk around, and you're with a group, so suddenly it's not like this scary thing, it's just you asking about a price. And because again, you think sometimes for somebody who's collecting, if you walk in and ask a price, that means you've bought it. And obviously that's not the case.
Right. Well, and to the museum environment, even most museums have some sort of a financial commitment to be on an accessions committee, but you don't need to do that. Just get on the mailing list, go to openings. At a photography opening, surprisingly, you'll find people who are interested in photography, and who may know more than you do, and may share interests and help teach you. That's how I learned a lot. We had great luck to live in San Francisco, where there was a terrific museum that did a lot of photo shows. But that's true almost anywhere, even in New York.
Do you go to studio visits as well? Do you go to auction previews? Are those the kinds of places you also go to look?
All of the above.
Yeah.
I go to auction previews all the time because, again, it's like shopping, and it's
like a fair.
Yeah, education. And gallery visits, there are things like open studios, like Dumbo Open Studios and others that you can go to. And then there are often, artists love to have people come to their studio. So but there you need a hook of somebody to set it up.
Right.
So if you know people, they will set those kind of things up. And if you join just organizations, they will do it. But it's a very good thing too, because you learn about process, you learn about what's going on.
Yeah. Todd, is there a point at which someone should, this may be too general a question, but is there a point at which someone should, well, now it's time for me to turn to an art advisor?
No, I don't think advisors are necessary, at all. I think that the component is that every collector I know, I don't care who the collector is, and I don't care what they collect, is going to pay for their education. There are no free educations. And you're going to pay for your education in one of two ways. You are either going to feel that this is a process that you actually really do enjoy on your own, which is great. And as you develop your own taste and you buy things and you move through that arc of collecting, you may find out, well, you probably will at a certain point, particularly when the numbers get a little bigger, that you have made some possible errors in judgment, which is not a big deal. This happens to everybody. But that's one way you wind up paying for your education. I shouldn't have bought this piece. I didn't know enough about condition. We were talking about that. I shouldn't have bought this piece. I didn't understand that this was not an actual vintage print, but it was a later print. That's like a whole other issue. I shouldn't have collected this print because by this artist who I like, let's say Deanne Arbus, for the same price, I could have gotten an image that was more of a cynosure, more central to her output, all these sort of things, right? But these are all educational components that come with paying for your education. The other way that you pay for your education, potentially, a collector might, is to hire an advisor. And that advisor, as they're educating, which I said that modality is the important part of the relationship, would be able to help the client sidestep a lot of those errors in judgment. But then you wind up on your purchases paying the advisor on the purchases that you do make. So one way or the other, you're going to pay for your education. Some people like to be lone wolves. And they function better that way. There's nothing the matter with that. Some people enjoy, they're very busy. Many of the people, they have massive business interests they're running. They have families. They have all sorts of things they're doing. They have a limited scope of time, and they really appreciate, some of them, having somebody who has their best fiduciary interests at heart. There's no right way. There's no better or worse way. This is a personal decision that a collector makes at a certain point in their collecting, or perhaps when the numbers start to get bigger. Yeah. But that's kind of how an advisor fits into that equation, potentially.
Yeah. Can I ask you all what drew you to photography as opposed to painting or drawings or prints?
I'll start. My sister is a photographer. That is how I bought my first picture.
She sold it to you?
No, it was actually, it was Bill Cliff's Black Mesa from his New Mexico portfolio. Bill was a friend. She was breaking up a portfolio, hoping to sell off 9 of them so the 10th would be free to her.
Yeah.
So that was, but it really was, through her I got a love of art. It wasn't necessarily going to be photography, but photography was, and in many ways still is, like the last affordable art. That's less true today, I think, than in 1975. But there were remarkable things, particularly in retrospect, that were floating around for even somebody of modest means at that moment to be able to acquire things if you were lucky and not going to end up paying too much for your education in that process. But so that was a lot of it. And the community, again, fortunate to live in San Francisco where there was a strong community, historic community of photographic artists and a major institution with a remarkable collection and a group of people who collected around that, and I liked those people. So it was, yes, it was artistic, but it was also social.
Yeah, and I've collected many things over my life, mostly in the decorative arts area because I'm really interested in material culture. But photography to me was magazines, newspapers, and I entered it as a kid of the era where I just lived for whatever the latest issue of 17 or the college issue of Glamour. And this was, you got excited about that. Look, Life, those were the great era, and that's how you related to things. And I can see how, to a younger generation, you enter photography through Instagram in a not dissimilar way. That you see so many images, and these are images that... Yeah,
images are being served differently, but it's still
but they grab you, and they grab you, and they appeal to you. And that's really the way. The first things I bought were at a auction of paper magazines, kind of back supply. They were just selling things off, and those were among the first photos I bought. And I thought, this is great. The images that I grew up with, and that really meant something to me, I can own some of them.
I backed into photography, actually, because, I'm not a collector. I'm here as an advisor. I'm not here as, a collector per se, although over the last, 45 years, I have some stuff. But in the East Village, when I began with my peers, the people who were using photography necessarily weren't pure photographers. Photography was being used not as a sort of a subjective medium, but as an objective medium, at a remove. It was photography about photography, if that makes sense, rather than, image creation. So now some of that wasn't true. I mean, I remember buying very early in the 80s, Peter Hujar. I remember buying David Wojnarowicz, art books. Right. And I saw an interesting book, and I sort of pulled it off the shelf. I knew nothing about the artist. I just thought it was neat. It was an artist named Deanne Arbus. And it was the Aperture book. And I started paging through this book, and I'm like, oh, this is really great. Boy, this is kind of cool. And so that is kind of where that I got interested in recently. Just like as an aside, it was so fascinating. My favorite image in that book was, I know that the twins that are on the cover are very iconic work, but the piece somehow that resonated with me for some reason was the triplets on their bed in New Jersey. Oh, yeah. And one of these images, I already own a Lifetime image that's signed and dated by Deanne, but another one came up, like I need another, but this is, part of the sickness, right? Comes up recently at the Elton John sale, which just happened at Sotheby's. Yeah. And it was a beautiful, smaller version of the print, Lifetime print, the whole deal. Condition was great. And I thought a dealer would buy it, because dealers buy things at auction and then they mark them up, and so I put in a low bid, like a really low bid, really low, and I got it. Wow. And so now I have two of them. So it's funny, when you look at the arc of a career, how things that you remember from way back 40, 45 years ago wind up, perhaps in your hands. And that's what makes the whole collecting odyssey so fun and interesting and worthwhile as a lifetime commitment.
Well, I think that's a really nice place to open it up for questions from all of you. Go ahead.
I could practice for 1,000 years and never produce any good art, so I'll take myself out of this conversation.
Yeah, I did enough life drawing when I was young to realize I was not going to make a living as an artist.
I knew I could never do visual art, but I liked the general concept. So, I have a doctorate in art history, for what I do, but I also have a doctorate in music composition at the same time. And I've played with Phil Glass, and Philip supported me early on. So I've been able to do a lot of projects with artists, with visual artists, which have musical, that kind of thing early when I was a young man. Not now. I don't do it anymore. But so I, again, kind of backed into it. And that's been a nice way to be able to collaborate with a lot of visual artists who I admired at the time when I was doing that sort of stuff, and have that give and take, but not have to be a visual artist. So.
I think there was a question here.
As now I have the microphone, I was thinking there are two questions, but maybe first it'll just be a comment. All of us who are collectors probably have lots of photo books, and that's just the best possible place to start and keep going. And you can curate your own shelves. You can move your books around. It's easier than moving a photograph from upstairs to downstairs, but so the books are a great way to go. And the question I had is, I think we're at a point now with the creative process in photography where the digital question is kind of, let's say, stabilized. We can now see some beautiful, beautiful prints that, yes, we're done with digital files. And I guess I'm asking the panel, I think we're in an era where it's about the print, whether it was created in 1852 or it was created yesterday, and may very well have been digital, and it isn't quite as important. If it was digital, I want your view on that. If we still are thinking about that, because sometimes conversations turn into a digital question versus whether that's as important to understand as much as there's some beautiful images now, and it is, in my world, it doesn't seem like it makes as much difference how they were made.
I don't want to take us down a rat hole, but I think I would have said 6 months ago or 8 months ago that the digital question was answered. But post large language models, I'm not positive that we haven't gone right back into that swirl and can't predict where that's going to go. It may still be, to your point, whatever the end product is will be what we consume and what we judge the result from. So the print, whatever form that takes in the future. But I do think we're at a place where we have to start asking again what generated that image.
Yeah.
Hi. It's interesting. So I know, like Todd, you have 2 places that you live, but I'm curious about the storage of things that you have. So the 3 of you clearly have more than you can put on the wall. And so do you use an outside source? Have you created a cellar where it's like impermeable? What do you do about the storage of your excess or the back catalog or however you want to call it, your collection?
I don't use outside storage. I have storage in my building. I try to keep it somewhat climate controlled. I'm aware that there are certain things that I've had that I get rid of because I don't feel like I can, if it's a one-off. Years ago, I mean, it's not so much with photography, I collected textile art and quilts, and I sold them. I just said, I cannot provide the kind of storage that will maintain these one-off historical objects. With photography, there are a few things I have that are one-off or so rare that I don't exhibit as much. But I try actually, because I want to live with what I have, to be careful. That's the great thing about a multiple. There are things that you're custodian of that you should give to a museum that's going to properly take care of it. And there are things you put on the wall, and we talked about this at the SIDLEY tour this morning. People said, how do you keep it in a corporate collection? I say, I wouldn't buy the Robert Frank original cover of the Americans only copy and put it in the middle of a conference room. The lights go up, the thing. So you try to modulate what you put where best you can, with that in mind. And that's what I'm talking about. I mean, I try not to have too many things in my possession that are the only one of that thing.
Boy, I got a lot of only things. I mean, that does not imply that they're valuable, believe me, but they are unique. But I think light is, light's the biggest issue. A lot of the collection tends to be gelatin silver prints, which are pretty stable if you keep them out of light. And I keep them in flat files. I'm always running right along that line of, do I now need to get outside storage, and try to stay just south of that line. But photography, one of the good things about photographs, particularly if you don't overmat them or have them all framed, is they don't take up that much space. A lot of times I will buy a photograph and have it shipped to me unmatted because there's nothing of interest on the mat. I know that at some point it'll get shown somewhere. I'll mat it the way I want to mat it. And there are flat file draws that have 300 images have 300 prints in them because they're unmatted, and many of them are small.
I have so much storage.
Well, you've got those basketballs that you need to.
I have actually I won't say the storage facility, but I actually have a dedicated area that's locked and separate at a well-known storage area that I've dealt with for over a quarter century. And in order to minimize that, the significant pieces of very high value are loaned out long-term to institutional collections. I try to do my best, particularly institutions that aren't the superstar level institutions, so less to a Met or MoMA or something like that, and more to the High Museum in Atlanta or the Detroit Institute of the Arts, which is my hometown, for instance. That's sort of like a hometown team, or Des Moines, or institutions of that type that might not be able to have access to some of the things that I own, and certainly aren't going to be able to buy them, because it doesn't really help to put the fourth version of a thing in an institution. They already have 3 others up on the wall, but for a smaller institution in the middle of a more rural area, that might be their only chance to have a 5-year loan of that type of thing. So it's about finding the best matches for that kind of situation, I think. But yeah, I mean, the problem is I just don't believe in selling anything. Like, I refuse to walk away from equity. I just won't sell. I've sold 1 item in my entire life, and it was a photograph, so I apologize, by Cindy Sherman. Once and one time only, and that's it. So I've got everything I've ever pretty much purchased over the decades, yeah.
I have
Well, when I was, particularly when I knew Andy and I was young, but I mean, those weren't things I owned, though that I was acting as as an advisor, but we're talking about our own personal things that we physically own here. That's different.
I have a suggestion and then a question that I hope David forgives me for asking.
I doubt it.
So I love the whole concept of knowledge base, knowledge accumulation, paying for knowledge. When I started, I would read everything that John Zurkowsky wrote, and that was a great thing.
Good place
And then
to
a
start.
great resource became auction catalogs and the essays they would write about each artist. And so now I think a great resource is Instagram, and if you follow people like Alex Soth or David Campany. And so my question is, David, can you share with us your account, which I think is a splendid case to learn from?
All right, so
Okay, what is it?
you go to Instagram, it's @BlackDogCollection. Black Dog Collection.
Black dog.
Dog,
Okay.
D-O-G.
Yeah.
I'm a dog guy too. And what you'll find is every picture in there is a picture that I own. And what I do is write an essay on them about history in some form. In some cases, the history of that picture. In some cases, it's the history the picture shows in a clear way. In many other cases, it's the story and the context and the historical space in which that picture came out of.
Follow.
Thank you for asking
Yeah.
that question.
Yeah.
You're going to get a lot of new followers.
Well,
Yeah.
that's good.
And one ex-friend.
Yeah, exactly. But that's also one of, I mean, I don't, that, if you're in a museum exhibition and you see a Black Dog collection, that is me, but I've never understood this thing where people want to put their name over everything.
Thank you so much, everybody.